Lord, thank you for your wonderful, amazing creation. Thank you that we can see your enjoyment of creation in a garden and that we can share in that enjoyment. We ask that you will help us this evening to learn more about sharing that enjoyment of creation through gardening and to be ready to practice sharing and caring and through Garden Church. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'd like to hand over to Lucy. Lucy, thank you very much for joining us. We know that you provide this presentation as part of the course, the Potting Shed course that Hazelnut Farm runs, and you're a trustee there. You live in Sheffield. I nearly said here in Sheffield because I'm in Sheffield as well. I've met Lucy 3 or 4 times, and you're a pioneer minister in an inner city estate, and you have a garden church there. So we're looking forward to hearing more about it. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Fabulous. Well, it's really lovely to be here. As Catherine said, I currently lead a new church. We've only been going for a year, in between 2 housing estates in Sheffield, both of which are in the 10% most deprived in the country. So that really does inform my experience on the ground. I also, in my spare time, help run Hazelnut Community Farm, which is a charity. I lifted what we technically do because I often forget. We seek to see churches and communities flourishing in the ecological crisis by helping them to create natural spaces of peace that have social innovation, economic inclusion, and political and spiritual transformation at their heart. So decoded, that basically looks like supporting churches and Christian groups to create and develop community gardens, allotments, and growing projects, which are informed by their faith and engage with mission in some kind of way. So within that, my main role really is leading a course called Potting Shed, and that course, it supports people wanting to start those kind of projects. So wanting to start garden churches, allotments, growing projects more broadly, as a sort of expression of church, you could say, as a fresh expression. And that course is really holistic. We look at everything from how to compost, to permaculture principles, to forming patterns of worship and discipleship in the garden. So I will do a little plug for that at the end, if you don't mind, in case anybody's interested in joining. And usually on Potting Shed, I don't do much of the talking. I pass it over to people who have far more experience and expertise than me. But I'm hoping that this evening I can draw on some of their wisdom as well as my own passion and experience to share with you about what garden church can look like. So first, I just wanted to start with a little bit of how I got involved in this movement, because it's not really because I was massively passionate about gardening to start with. It came out of necessity for me, and then later I gained passion. So in lockdown, I moved onto an estate with the remit to plant a church. And I was looking for ways that we could legally gather, because we all remember you couldn't actually gather inside legally, and ways to do something nice for the community, to engage the community, and to gather people and keep people busy, especially teenagers who were struggling to keep busy during lockdown. And so we met outside at various locations. We began meeting in a park. Then we prayer walked, and we found this beautiful pond, which I'll show you some pictures of now. I think I've got some pictures of that. There's pictures later on of it. And so we gathered at this pond, which felt like it could be a real key place in the community. It was abandoned and overgrown. It's almost like a lake. It's like a fishing lake in the middle of an urban estate. And so we started to meet there and do some development work there and some community groups there. And that was really wonderful. And then we finally got a church building, but our community had really enjoyed doing the outdoor stuff. And we also, during lockdown, turned our front garden at the vicarage into a little community allotment. So we put some raised beds in with some teenagers, and they would come round in the afternoons and help us plant, help in the loose term, because I wasn't very good at advising people on how to garden then. I had to redo a lot of it when they left. But it was lovely, and a really lovely way to engage them. So once we got a church building, a lot of our community actually wanted to carry on doing things outdoors. It was kind of how we'd started and how we'd bonded and how we'd been worshipping. And so we wanted to keep that going. So I'll chat more in a little bit about how Garden Church looks for us now. But for us, that it really kind of grew out of almost an accident. And now it's something we're so passionate about and something that's very much woven into the fabric of our church. And we do have the more conventional side of church as well, but it's very much part of our expression of what we do. So to backtrack, I wanted to speak a little bit about the why. So at Potting Shed, we always start the first session with why Garden Church, why community growing projects, why should churches bother? And it seems a bit odd to preach to the converted, as it were, but we find that often it's something that even people who feel intrinsically drawn to do a project like this struggle to articulate why it's important to their PCCs, to their church committees, to people in their church, to get people behind this kind of project. So looking at the why first is what we're going to do this evening, and then I'll move on to how it can look in different ways, and I'll share a little bit of how we make it look, and also some different churches around the country that I'm connected with. So first, looking at the why, let's start with the theological. For me, that is always the most important place to start. Theologically, what is our motivation for Garden Church? And there are two basic statements that inform this for me. First of all, God calls us to partner with nature, and nature speaks to us about who God is. So it's both and. He calls us to partner with nature, but nature also speaks to us about who he is. So we know Genesis begins, God created the earth and he saw that it was good. And our first mandate in the Genesis poem as humans was to care for the earth, to be good stewards of it. But we know we don't take this mandate seriously. At Potting Shed last night, we were chatting about this, and someone described it as, I thought it was quite a fun image. She had not fun for the person the story's about, but fun in terms of understanding this. She had a friend who built up a business, and she loved this business, and she went on maternity leave and found someone to cover it. And when she got back, the business had just completely crumbled. It was not what she had intended it to be. It was just, she was absolutely distraught. But she knew she could build it back, but she was so sad this person she thought she could trust had basically taken her baby, the thing that she was so proud of, the thing that she loved, had taken it and just not looked after it. I thought that was quite a helpful image, thinking about how God has given us this thing that he wants to work with us on. He trusts us with it. He loves it. And we know that we haven't treated it well. We don't take that mandate, that command seriously. And as we all know, climate crisis has its roots way back in human history. It's not a recent thing that's just popped out of nowhere. Particularly when we think theologically, it's wrapped up in the sins of humanity for hundreds and thousands of years back through human history. And sin, it feels like a tricky thing to talk about sin, but I think it's really important in thinking about our theological motivation and how it can inform why we might do Garden Church. So there's a school of thought that I find really helpful when thinking about sin, and also preaching about sin, as disconnectedness, discord, or conflict between us and God, between us and other people, and us and ourselves. And I would add to that us and the planet, us and creation. When there's discord, disconnectedness, conflict between us and the planet, God's creation, that's sinfulness. And it also connects with all those others as well. In Genesis, we hear that Adam, or Hadam, was made from the dust, the mud of the earth. And Hadam means mud person. The creation poem speaks about our intrinsic connectedness with the earth. And sin ignores that connectedness. It denies the dependence, the respect and care that we should have. And instead, it sees us disconnected, disengaged, engaged in conflict instead, pillaging the earth selfishly for our own ends. The more we take and mine from the earth for our own whims, the less we enjoy it and work with it and respect it. I've stolen this analogy from a friend, but she described this journey of humanity's, but this sort of meta narrative of humanity's relationship with the earth as beginning with, say, a child in a garden, playing with the mud and the soil, getting the mud between their nails, absolutely loving it and having so much fun with it. And then as they get a little bit older, they put on the gardening gloves and they plant things not so much for fun, but because of how it looks to the neighbours, and you want it to look prim and proper and have your nice borders, and you're not so worried about just it being a beautiful place of joy for you. You're kind of, you've got a little bit of a different motivation. And then as you realise you can profit from it, you bring in the big guns, the big tools, the machines, and you start pillaging the earth, pillaging that land, and disconnecting from it. You start using tools to basically plough the earth for its resources, rather than to enjoy it like that initial child who had their fingers and their hands in the mud. Creation's been commodified. And I'm not saying tools are bad, and they are necessary. And my nails really do benefit from when I use tools rather than just my hands. But I do think it's a helpful image. That physical connection with the earth is important as God's creative people. And as those who seek to live lives informed by love for him, by communities that seek to live lives informed by love for him, connecting with the earth is a really natural thing for us to want to do. And what I found from trying to inhabit my own connectedness with the earth more and more, being less worried about the mud in my fingernails and enjoying time spent with the soil, is that revelations about God have deeper meaning. They come to life more. And so do the parables and biblical teachings that use nature and agriculture as illustrations. I feel like in church, broadly speaking, we've lost creation as a thing that speaks to us of God by diminishing the connectedness with creation in our lives. We're losing images of God. So I want to share some pictures with you of how this can look. So the front here was when we first started, the top left-hand corner is when we first started planting in my front garden at the vicarage. And down here is when we first got the community garden at church. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in a little while. So going back to the why of why this matters. The first is theological. It brings us closer to God. So thinking of those things I was just saying, there are maybe three in particular things that I think that connecting in this way with God helps us to relate to him, to get to know him better. And the first is seeing the image of him and knowing in a really tangible way of him as provider, which is kind of obvious, and I think we can all see that God's provision is everywhere. There's so much food as well, and things that spring up naturally from the ground. That's one thing that we've learned doing garden church, is so much of it you don't even have to do anything. It just naturally comes out, and it's always the stuff the kids enjoy eating the most. It's the fruit, the berries, all that kind of beautiful sweet stuff just happens naturally. And that's so wonderful to speak of God's provision, especially with children about. And we can see in nature so many ways that God provides for the little bugs and insects and animals, and that's another beautiful way to talk to children about how God really cares about the little things in life. And quite often we are so dependent on ourselves that it's really important to remember that God ultimately provides us everything that we have. And it can take a bit of working with him, but ultimately he provides everything that we need. The second thing that I think gardening, and especially gardening community, tells us about God is his desire to partner with us. So while some food does grow naturally from the ground, some of it also requires cultivating. And God loves that creativity. He loves to work with us and work towards his new creation. One of the things that I love to remind people about God is that he is a God who doesn't just want us to worship him, he wants us to work with him. When we look at the biblical narrative, it starts with a garden and it ends with a garden city. And I think that's such a beautiful image of what God has provided us. He wants us to work with him, to be creative, to innovate, and to create a new world with him. And why not start that now? Why not show little pockets of that in the world now? There's a beautiful book called Refuge of Faith. I can't remember who it's written by, but I can add it in the chat later, which speaks about this. It's a natural phenomenon, but she talks about it in a theological way as well, of little pockets in nature where, if there's been a natural disaster, there are these little pockets of life, and these little pockets of life have so much power to regenerate a space. And I think that's true of us. If we just do little symbols of moving towards this garden city, moving towards the new creation with God, then that is a beautiful symbol of partnering with him. And the next thing that I think we see in God through gardening is that he's the Redeemer. He wants to bring new life, and we partner with him in that, but he brings about regeneration. As God's church, connecting with and exploring these things together is so fruitful for teaching and discipleship, also for our own relationship with God. I find it so much easier to go into a garden and speak about who God is with something physical in my hand, talking to a child, than trying to even just getting a book out and trying to read it to them. It helps us really tangibly experience God in a beautiful way. So the next reason I have on the why is missional, bringing us closer to community. So often we think in the church about mission in quite a reactive way. So we might say, this thing has gone wrong in my community, so I will respond. The church will respond, which is great. Or this thing is currently really cool in society, so we're going to shape our outreach around it to attract people, which is, again, absolutely great, good thing to do. But I think as God's church, we're also called to be prophetic communities who point to who he is and how things can be in a world which knows and loves him. The biblical narrative starts with a garden and ends with a garden city. To me, that speaks of the fact that God invites our creativity, innovation, and collaboration to help inform the new creation we look forward to. So working towards that isn't just a hypothetical thing, it's a tangible thing, it's a missional thing we can be doing. In the midst of climate crisis, we need to be responsive to the issues. Of course we do, that is so important. We need to be reactive, but we can also prophetically point to a better way of being, a better way of existing with the planet. Net zero, so important. Cutting back our harm to the planet, vital. But also thinking about our relationship with the earth, thinking about how we can re-examine that relationship, thinking about, rather than just ourselves as leeches that take from the planet and just trying to minimize our effect on the planet as much as possible, starting to reimagine how we can actually contribute and work with the planet is a really powerful thing to do. And it speaks of a God who doesn't want us to just minimize ourselves, but wants us to contribute in beautiful and powerful ways to the earth that he gave us. There's also wonderful outreach opportunities through gardens, and I'll talk a little bit more about them when I give some practical examples. But first of all, outreach opportunities. Walls of a church can be a real barrier to people. Some people don't like coming into a strange building with stained glass windows they can't see through and a big wooden door. It's scary to them. So being in a garden, people just wander past and ask you, what's going on? Also, Church of England, for those who are members of the Church of England, is one of the biggest landowners in the country. So land is not a hard resource to find. Also, it's a very cheap church planting strategy, but that's a different thing. It's also fantastic for outreach to children. The Children's People and Nature Survey, which was done in 2022, says that 83% of children are worried about the environment and want to do more to look after it. and around 20% are more positive. No, children are on average 20% more positive about their local green spaces than their local built up spaces. So children want to be in nature, they want to care for nature. And also some communities, like the one I'm in, don't have the safest green spaces. So being able to offer those safe green spaces is so vital. Also, forest schools are increasingly oversubscribed. It's getting harder and harder to get a place for children in a forest school. And mainstream schools are trying to integrate more forest school sessions into their curriculum, but struggle to do it because of budgeting. If that's something we can offer, what a fantastic thing. Another fantastic missional opportunity is food growing. For starters, food poverty, absolutely huge at the moment. In September last year, and it's likely a lot higher now, 18% of households faced food insecurity, and over half of families on universal credit did. Record numbers of people are using food banks, but food banks often aren't able to provide fresh food. They have to provide canned and dried goods. So being able to supplement food banks with fresh produce that has been grown in the community is such a wonderful thing that we can offer. Nutrition is also a huge problem in a lot of communities. So being able to get people to eat things that they've grown, or that they've seen grown, or that they've been gifted is a wonderful thing. I mean, I've had kids who their parents say they never eat anything that isn't beige, eating peas straight off the plant. So, you know, people do engage more when they've seen where it comes from. We've talked about this a little bit, but another missional opportunity is to show regeneration, a physical symbol of hope, to regenerate a space. It shows who God is to the community in a really beautiful way. And we can also support local habitats and ecosystems. So we're being missional to the planet as well. Rewilding is a fantastic thing. Adopting and teaching permaculture methods, also fantastic. Introducing bodies of water. There are so many ways that we can make spaces better for the local area, better for the local ecosystem. Oh, this is a good point. I've just written in it, compost is a teaching tool, because I just remembered this. There's someone who's part of our growing collective at Hazelnut, and he has spoken about using compost to speak to children about regeneration. It's fantastic. So he says what he does is he gets Lego, and he's asked them to build something. So, you know, build a tractor, and then he pulls the tractor apart, says that's great. And then he says, okay, now I want you to build me a house. And then they go to pick up the Lego again. He goes, no, you can't use that. And then they sort of go, oh, no, you can't just throw away Lego. You rebuild it, you use it again. And he's like, that's the same with nature. We have compost. We take what we have, we put it back, it regenerates, and it helps new things grow, new things come out of it. And we had someone preach at our church a few months ago who took that one step further and was speaking about how God is never finished with us, and how in compost we see regeneration. Even the things that we throw away and the things that feel awful are reused by God, and how we can have new life through it. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. So I just wanted to share that. So regeneration is fantastic missional opportunity. And then mental health and well-being, a huge area, and Catherine, I'm sure, can share a little bit more on this later on in the discussion. But social prescribing to community gardens has become so much more common. I know Hazelnut in Bristol have had a partnership with the NHS locally and had people being prescribed there for sessions. And I think that's largely just because it's just become so much more, I think since lockdown, it's become so much more known that the benefits of being outdoors, of being in nature, of connecting with people, connecting with the land. Interestingly, there are actually studies, this is something I found really interesting, that show that the neuron level within ourselves, when we touch the earth, soil, dirt and mud, something changes when we touch the bacteria M. vaccae, which is in the soil, and it makes us more resilient to stress. So genuinely, there's an actual change in our brains when we touch soil that makes us more resilient to stress. Isn't that a fantastic thing? Beautiful thing. But yeah, I'm sure we can talk more about that later in the discussion. And then lastly, and this is very quick for the why, personal. All of those things apply to us as well. Connection, well-being, connectedness, real physical connectedness with the soil is good for us. And God created us to be part of a connected whole, to work with the land, with creation. So it's going to be good for us. If it's what we're called and made to do, it's going to be good for us. And it can give purpose. It can provide us a community. There's so many wonderful things that it does for us as individuals as well. So before we talk more about the why, I'm sure we can talk about that in discussion as well. Let's move on to some examples of how it can look, because I'm sure that's far more interesting anyway. So I thought I would start with my own experience at Hazelnut we called it Hazelnut before, it's now just at our church in Sheffield. So how can it look? So here are some pictures of how it's looked for us. So we began with only doing outdoor worship. So it's a slightly different context to most churches, I'm sure, to start there, rather than go from a more conventional church setting to being outdoors. But we began only doing outdoor worship. So that top left-hand corner is as we started to gather a sort of core of church members, and we were meeting in the local community garden. And then we started doing things like prayer walking, litter picking. We began nature clubs. The bottom left here is a local community space by the pond. And in that community space, we replanted these beautiful planters that the council had put in. And very sadly, they all got pulled out the next day. We went back down to replant them. They got pulled out again. We did that 4 times. It was really difficult, but we put wildflowers in. It does look quite beautiful now. But so we started there, and then when we got our land, so the first thing we did was put a fire pit in, and that's what that middle picture at the top is. So this was the garden behind our church. So we put a fire pit, because we're a BMO, we don't need any faculties. So that's why we get away with this stuff. We put a fire pit in because we wanted to have a place to gather, but also to commemorate that God is at the center of what we do. So I spoke about how fire represents the presence of God in the Bible, and we read some stories about that. And then we built this fire pit to mark that we wanted God to be the center of this community garden. And then and we started cooking on the fire as well, which has been really fun. We also have a swing, which is probably the most popular thing in the garden. Loads of kids on the way home from school ask if they can use our swing. So the ways we've used this garden, the main way, which is probably of interest, is our Wild Church. So Wild Church is a Sunday afternoon service that we do. We've stopped doing it in the winter because no one turned up, quite rightly, too cold. But we do it in the spring and summer. And it basically looks like, it's kind of like a messy church but outdoors. So it's a choose your own adventure. Families show up, we have activities, games, nature crafts, cooking, jobs in the garden, and people go around and do those things. And then we gather around the fire at the end for prayer, for a Bible story, and we eat whatever's been cooked on the fire together. And we found it a really fantastic way of engaging with children with special educational needs who struggle to be contained in the confines of a normal church setting. They absolutely love having the freedom of the garden. It's also been fantastic to communicate things about God with really young children. There was a 4-year-old who was talking to his friend about God, the God who was invisible, but we felt in the wind because he makes things happen, which I just thought was really lovely. So it's a really tangible, wonderful way to connect with children. We've also done communion before by baking bread on the fire. I didn't have a picture of this, sadly, but we got sticks and then we made dough and we wrapped it around the sticks, and then we cooked the bread on the fire, and we had that as our communion bread, which was a really beautiful thing and a way to engage the kids as well in communion. We also do some other stuff outdoors. We have a gardening club on a Wednesday afternoon for adults, which is just a nice place for people to socialise, to engage with nature, and it's a way for us to connect people in the community who wouldn't usually come to church. And also we basically treat our garden like any room in our church. It's used as much for worship and community stuff as the rooms are inside. And we also hire it out. We've got a forest school using it during the Easter holidays. We have a kids club who help us water plants after school. So it's just been a really fantastic way to connect with people and bring them into the sort of church area. And because we've got a massive fence around our church, which I wouldn't have chosen, but I'm glad we have it now, it's a safe space for children just to run around safely, and that's been really wonderful. So that's enough about us. If you have any more questions later, I'm very happy to answer them. But just quickly before we go into breakout rooms, a couple more projects that may be inspiring. So the bottom two pictures here are from Hazelnut Community Farm's main site in Bristol. So they don't have a building at all. They just have land. That is the church. And they found it really fruitful for worship. I would say John, who runs that, is much more evolved in his services than I am. They are much more theologically deep. They do this really fun thing with communion where as part of the communion liturgy, he hides the wine. I couldn't do this in my community because the children would drink the wine. He hides the wine in a flower bed and talks about how the things of communion come from the earth, and the children go and find the wine and they bring it up and they do this communion service. And it's really lovely, but yeah, not something we could do in our context. They are also much more productive food growers than we are. We only have 5 raised beds, but they are essentially a community farm, so they have very productive food growing and are able to donate to a local food project, as well as have lots of people take food home for themselves, which is fantastic. They also have growing days. They do seed blessings, which is a really lovely thing. Seed swaps with the community as well. And that's a fantastic garden church. And then up to the left top here is a garden church called Dewey's Acre in St David's, and that is quite different in a way, in that Sophie, who was part of beginning that, found this sort of neglected plot of land by St David's Cathedral, and thinking about it as a place of pilgrimage, wanted to create a beautiful place of peace for people on pilgrimage to come and be still. And then she also started thinking about connecting schools, so she got the schools in to create this help create this beautiful space. And they also have gardening groups and people who come and cultivate the land. But I just thought it's a slightly different way, a flavour of doing it. You know, it's that idea of pilgrimage and peace, more than food growing and trying to gather local community. It's more of like a spiritual community, I suppose. So through Hazelnut, we have connection with so many different forms of garden churches. Some people are on allotments. Some people are just rewilding graveyards and using pots in front of the church. We have people using car parks and just, again, putting pots and tyres and things on top of the car parks. We have a huge variety of ways this can look practically. Some of my images are disappearing on here very oddly, but I just wanted to quickly, before we go into breakout rooms, and again, you're very welcome to ask me any questions or clarifications in our discussion later. But we have at Hazelnut a couple of things coming up. So the picture on the left that isn't appearing on the screen is a potting shed. So we've just finished the most recent potting shed course, which is for people who would like to start community gardens as expressions of churches. But the next one will be in autumn. So if you're interested in that, maybe keep that in mind. And then to the right there is the Sustaining Church Conference. So there are 2 conferences coming up, one in Bristol and one in Sheffield. And they are essentially looking not just at garden churches, but also more broadly, how churches can engage in a really practical way with climate crisis. So if that's something you're interested in, please do come along. But other than that, I think I'm done and we can go into breakout rooms. One question I would add to the questions we have for breakout rooms. So the questions we have are, if I can be reminded, the questions were, is in the chat, how could garden church be encouraged in your area? I would maybe say, do you want it to be encouraged in your area? Maybe you don't. And what would be the challenges? I would add to that, what might be the first steps? You can run Dewey's Acre. They did everything all at once, and they made this beautiful site. We started by people growing pots on their windows because we didn't have a site to grow things to start with. So people were just growing tomatoes and basil and stuff on their windows that we then transplanted into a site. So maybe what might be the first steps could be another question. But I think you'll be sent into breakout rooms now.
Lucy, thank you so much. This is a delayed thank you from me. I got thrown off. I should have picked up when you and I met earlier that my computer's having problems today. But that was so insightful. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for the lovely images. And it was really interesting, incredibly interesting to think about reconnecting after the disconnect. And the way the examples you gave of how in your own community and other communities, those reconnections have happened. And I hope that led to really good discussions in the breakout groups. You'll have had the questions. I'm sorry I didn't repeat the questions because I wasn't here to do so, but shall we, I'll just ask David if you could tell me please the name of one person in group 1, and I'll just ask you to feed back a couple of sentences, please, from if you did discuss the questions or anything else you discussed after hearing Lucy's talk.
I don't have the numbers up anymore, so somebody who was in group 1, if they could do the feedback, that would be great.
Yeah. Group 1, do we have someone from group 1, please?
I think we've got Lucy, haven't we?
Would you like to nominate someone else in your group, Lucy?
Yeah, you go ahead.
I'll go. Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
So we heard some well, loads of enthusiasm for a kickoff, but also some really lovely ideas about what people could do. We got so embroiled in the first question that we didn't actually get very far into the later ones, but the idea of growing together and making things accessible and being able to share with community groups or food banks that need it was really high up on the list. One that really struck me as well, though, was a rebellious little bunch of Christians who've forayed out from their church after lockdown on an amicable basis, but started doing things out in nature, and are now starting to think about how they can not just use that as an opportunity for praise and worship, but also for mission and outreach. So it's kind of evolving, I guess, and I thought that was really, really lovely. If anybody else wants to bail in and kick me under the table and tell me what I've missed, please do that.
That's great, Kat, though. Thank you. And again, it's about that making those connections. And I was struck earlier when you did point out, Lucy, that people can more easily connect sometimes outside. And then we have a lot of connecting to do with each other, with the earth, with creation, and with God. And obviously with our communities and the needs like the food banks. Thank you, Kat. Who was in group 2, please?
I think that was me, Catherine. But
hey, Barbara, would you like to feedback or nominate?
I will, just quickly. Yes, I think interestingly, growing food for the food bank was one really good thing. But the main thing that came out was the offshoots that you get from this, like a growth in church members, more sustainable financing. You wouldn't think that, but it can have unexpected consequences, having something like a church garden, and connecting with other groups. So you may do something, just your little church group doing it, But if you invite other like-minded groups around in the area to come in and join you with it, your outreach, more people are coming in and joining with you and learning about nature and growing food and growing whatever you're doing. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you, Barbara. As Lucy said, it really is fresh expressions, and it's about fresh ways of doing things, leading, as you say, to new offshoots and even new finances. It's wonderful. Shall we go through and each group feedback, carry on feeding back on that first question, and then if anyone did discuss the second question, what are the challenges, we can come back. So group 3, who is in your group?
Well, I can represent group 3. We didn't have a designated leader. My name is Dan, but we just discussed our own context, and it was fascinating. We were, we had 4 very, very different contexts from a hugely deprived area in Luton, where they're using, it's a Quaker group using a cemetery and sort of allowing that to grow naturally, to I'm in Gloucester, where we've got a mixture of some urban spaces and very easy access to more rural areas, and so there's a lot of possibilities there. Another one in Sheffield with Colin with his Anglican Baptist church, and of course Sheffield has a lot of densely urban areas where there's such a need for people to have access to green space, and then someone from a seaside village or town, what was it, not Sidmouth, anyway, somewhere down there, and where people have space, have rural areas of their own. But that led us to thinking, but what about the elements of community, of doing it together? Because it came up that British people can be, although almost everyone in Britain, it's like gardening is in the blood, but yet people can be quite possessive about their own gardens, their own space, and joining together, finding ways to do it communally, has so many other benefits than just doing the beautiful gardening in your back of your house. So
yes, absolutely. And again, I think that links into that different way of connecting. Lucy's lovely imagery at the beginning of, firstly we connect as a child, and then we actually start doing things for almost utilitarian reasons, and to try and make our plot look one better than the neighbours almost, and pristine. But when we do things in community, we enjoy and we share that enjoyment, and that grows as well, doesn't it? So yes, and the common theme in different settings, as you say, urban, inner city, rural and coastal. Lovely. Thank you, Dan. What about group 4?
I believe that was my group. We started off actually on the second question, so if I may,
Yes.
And the obstacles for some of us was the fact that our churches are quite small in number, and often with quite elderly people, some of whom haven't got the necessary health to work in allotment or do some of the more heavy gardening type jobs. And it occurred to me, one of the people in our group made the comment that Garden Church might be particularly attractive to younger people who are rejecting this idea that we go to church because we're inheriting a belief from our parents and we carry on that tradition, but rather they're more into doing. And so this idea of actually, many of the ideas that Lucy was sharing with us about partnering with God might theoretically be attractive, but the issue is how we reach from our churches with maybe elderly and small congregations to those larger churches. And I'm thinking of, I went to Vineyard in Nottingham where they have about 500 people, average age about 25. If only we could get that kind of size group enthusiastic about it. And I think for many churches, retention of young people is an issue, and broadening their theologies is something which I think we ought to be striving to do, and maybe making connections in the area. I want to join the chat. There are at least 2 requests to visit Lucy, and I want to add a third one. I want to visit Lucy as well.
You don't have far to go, Tim, to visit Lucy.
But I think this idea of actually making connections with nearby churches, if we might have an idea, but maybe it's the church next door that is the one that has the land that we could utilise, or whatever. My church's land is owned by the local authority, and we're limited in what we could actually do in it. There was another comment that was made about the possibility of services in people's gardens. That's a nice idea I hadn't come across before. We've done Forest Church in our church, which because our church doesn't have appropriate space, we go to a park a couple of miles away. I've done that particularly with the children in the summer, and that's worked very well. And I guess there's very close affinity between garden church and Forest Church.
Mm. That's really interesting, Tim, that you looked at challenges and you came up with a few challenges, and you began to look at different ways of connecting again to solve some of those. And I wonder whether another way of connecting is with those older people who may not be able to grow now, but they can cook. So what grows often gets cooked, and they can share their expertise in that way, maybe. Really interesting. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
What about group 5?
Is that our group? I don't know what group I was in. Yeah, can you hear me?
Like to go ahead if you are you happy to
yeah, I'm happy to go ahead. I was in a group with about 5 others. One said his church really couldn't do anything because they were in Ireland. Somebody else was concerned about disability issues, not getting into Hazel Church or something. I'm involved in Middlesbrough in a garden around St Chad's, St Oswald's, which is a very, very deprived area. And we have an eco shop. And during lockdown, we thought we'd do something with a garden. And so they put raised beds and beds around the church. And we have a polytunnel, which is been amazing. They cleared like 6 foot of nettles. And we just have lots of different people come in, and from elderly to kids to drug addicts and people who've got mental health issues. And so I work there Wednesday, Thursday, Friday morning, and I would love to do something like Forest Church or Garden Church, whatever. Wild Church.
Yes.
I've done forest education. I've done forest sort of schooling kind of thing, and had allotments with kids who weren't at school for years in Middlesbrough. So I thought of doing a church would be absolutely brilliant. Have some input on that.
Wonderful, Gaynor, and the very rough lands that had to be cleared in order for it to happen. You managed to get the stronger people to do the physically stronger.
Yeah,
people.
and they loved it. The stronger men,
the
mental health problems, just wanted to get out the house during lockdown. So literally, they cleared this whole passageway. And then Middlesbrough Environment City gave us some money for a polytunnel.
Yes.
We built some compost heaps, and we built some raised beds there.
And again, for some churches, a challenge could be, I guess, Lucy, I don't know what you think about raising the funds for that initial, making the raised beds, to putting up the polytunnel and that sort of thing.
Definitely. The one thing, connecting that to the disability point as well, there's actually quite a lot of funding for creating accessible gardens. It's quite easy to get, not easy, but relatively easy to get funding for. So we got funding from the local ward pot for ours on the proviso that we made the raised beds wheelchair accessible. Things like that are available.
I don't know if that's all the groups, or is there another group that hasn't fed back at all yet?
There's Margaret from
Margaret, of course. Yes, your group, Margaret. Could you feedback for us?
Yes, our garden is at the back of the church, so it's not necessarily that appealing, I suppose. It's very much like walking into a church. You've got to go around the back of the church, but we decided to go down the route of a quiet garden with the actual church garden, and we're looking for possible funding to make it disabled accessible. We have a rather nasty hump that needs to be removed and some sort of path put down. But we also are fortunate that we have access to the Lee Brook Valley, which is an A Rocha Partners in Action project, one of the first ones. And outdoor services have been held in the Lee Brook Valley, and maybe that's something that we need to perhaps make more of. But our problem, like I think a lot of people have said, is we're an aging group that are doing all the work, and trying to get younger people involved is proving extremely difficult. So that's sort of our biggest challenge, is getting more people involved.
Yes, and younger people. Thank you, Margaret. That's interesting, isn't it? So some young people may be in the group that social prescribing would help. Others would be simply having lifestyles where they're busy and aren't able to make more time, I guess. And Lucy talked about social prescribing earlier, and that's something that I'm really interested in. And there are known proven benefits, as we all know. We've heard a lot about connections and the NHS, and I think probably God before the NHS knew that connections are healthy for well-being, and we can make those connections with garden and with garden church, as we've heard so much about. There are various benefits that are listed by, there's a group called Thrive, which has some courses in social and therapeutic horticulture, and it also has some gardening centres for practicing these, which are disabled accessible. One is in Battersea Park, one is in Reading, and I think one's in Birmingham. And it's very, very important to remember that using plants and gardens and just touching soil, as Lucy has mentioned, can improve physical and mental health, and can increase and improve our communication and thinking skills as well. So the obvious points that Thrive make, I'll just go through them, are exercise and learning how to use or strengthen muscles, improved mental health through purpose and achievement, the opportunity to connect with others, reducing feelings of isolation or exclusion, acquiring new skills with the chances to then find employment, just feeling better for being outside. And so one thing that I thought that comes from that is within your garden church group, or your group of people who are active in this project, there may be some who do have that gardening expertise that some of us wish we really had, and can really advise on what plants to plant where and when, and how to look after them. So that's sort of one role. And then there are people who are quite good at matching the jobs that need doing with the skills and the abilities of the people who come, which would be another role. And then there's perhaps someone who would be good at motivating other people and motivating young people who might have contacts through youth groups and kids clubs, after school clubs. And then there'd be the other people who might pray about the garden church, and the people who might be good at designing. And again, I mentioned earlier cooking. So there are lots of different skills that can be used in garden church. I don't know if you'd like to add to that at all, Lucy.
I definitely completely agree with you. And I think one of the things that one of the most desired roles in our garden church is to make the tea and coffee. People love that role because they get to have a chat to everyone.
Absolutely.
But there are definitely a variety of roles. Just drawing as well on the attracting young people, I think you're definitely right. Social prescribing is there's a huge mental health crisis with young people at the moment. So that is an incredible opportunity to serve and minister to those people. Also, I would suggest getting in contact with schools. Schools work is such a fantastic way, and schools are so stretched at the moment that if a church offers to come in and do some nature stuff, they'll be like, yeah, please do it, wonderful. And also not just using your own land, but offering to regenerate local spaces, because again, the council's stretched, and if there's a group who want to create a new flower bed in the park, as long as there isn't a very passionate friends of group, then again, that's kind of how we got involved with the pond, is through doing that kind of stuff. And if people are already there, you're getting connections, you're not trying to get them to come to you. So there are, for connecting with younger people, I think, yeah, it's not just an issue with garden church, it's an issue with the church. Churches struggle to get young people. So I think, yeah, schools and going out and about in the community are two.
I mentioned also earlier that forest schools are completely fully booked, and that some schools are now providing forest school sessions. And I know some churches in our area, Lucy, have a church community worker or children's families worker who's going into the school to help with forest school. So there you've got that connection that you've just talked about. Yeah. I just wanted, on the point of regeneration, I don't know if you came back because I missed a bit. You mentioned a book earlier, and I just wanted to say that the book you mentioned is Islands of Abandonment, and it's by Cal Flynn. And I've Wow, actually, I did have the details ready to put in the chat. That was before I was thrown off, but I could quickly find them. While I look for those, would anyone else have any questions you'd like to ask Lucy or to throw open for discussion?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm having problems with chat and things at the moment with my internet. I just wondered if it was possible to do anything at Greenbelt, because it's a wonderful space.
Yeah.
Lots of people there, and sometimes these things are taken further, and whether we could meet informally, because it may be too late to get a formal space, I don't know.
Great idea. Yeah, fantastic.
Oh yes, we would love to perhaps link in with that idea, as Green Christian already do have a stall at Greenbelt, but to link in with that and have something about Garden Church sounds a really good idea. Thank you for that. This book, Lucy, this book is just going into the chat now. And as Lucy, as you said, it gives lots of stories of real pockets of nature that were in dreadfully damaged places, regenerating incredibly. So thank you all for your contributions. It's really been an insightful evening. It's been very interesting, and I think it's really sparked an excitement about Garden Church. So thank you for all your wisdom, Lucy. It was just fascinating. Thank you. I wondered if we could ask you one more kindness, Lucy, before we finish, and ask you to close in prayer, please.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is a prayer that we it's actually a poem that we often use at Potting Shed, and it's a poem by Mary Oliver, which I think a lot of people will know, and we use it as a prayer. So I'm just going to share that poem with us. My work is loving the world. Here the sunflowers, there the hummingbird, equal seekers of sweetness. Here the quickening yeast, there the blue plums. Here the clam deep in the speckled sand. Are my boots old? Is my coat torn? Am I no longer young and still not half perfect? Let me keep my mind on what matters, which is my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished. The phoebe, the delphinium, the sheep in the pasture, and the pasture, which is mostly rejoicing since all ingredients are here, which is gratitude, to be given a mind and a heart and these body clothes, a mouth with which to give shouts of joy to the moth and the wren, to the sleepy dug up clam, telling them all over and over how it is that we live forever. Amen.